In Cairo, Egypt's internal economy becomes
The
yet
death
another
of President
concern for
Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1970 marked the beginning of a new era in Egyptian politics. Nasser had been the country's most decisive figure since the Free Officers' coup of 1952. He championed a statist economic model, forged close ties with the Soviet Union in foreign policy, and promoted Arab nationalism both domestically and across the region. With his death, the vacuum that emerged in Egypt's leadership had to be filled quickly. As debates flared over who would become head of state, figures from the Nasser era put forward a name from the Free Officers movement, Mohammed Anwar Sadat. Despite his participation in the Free Officers, Sadat did not project the image of a prominent leader. He had carried out largely ceremonial duties within the state apparatus and had served as vice president. Within ruling circles, he was regarded as an ineffective figure. The sense of comfort created by this perception played a role in his appointment. Once in office, Sadat moved quickly. With the political purge launched in 1971, pro-Soviet cadres from the Nasser period were pushed out of the system. Sadat had begun to build his own sphere of power. Relations with the Soviet Union also changed course. The Egyptian leadership decided to limit military and economic cooperation with Moscow. In 1972, Soviet military advisors were expelled from the country. This development marked the beginning of a broader shift in foreign policy preferences. The Cairo government prioritized relations with the West. Naturally, the balance of domestic politics also began to change. Policies toward the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been harshly suppressed under Nasser, were softened. Mosque-based activities became more visible. Islamic rhetoric increased on university campuses. While the new regime did not define Islamists as direct allies, it would view them as a means of controlled opposition against the system. After Nasser's death, many believed Sadat was merely a temporary figure filling an authority gap. Yet, in a short time, Sadat emerged as a leader who consolidated his power, made his own decisions. In 1967, Egypt suffered a devastating defeat. Through an air campaign, Israel struck the bulk of Egypt's military power on the very first day of the war. Approximately 85% of Egypt's combat aircraft and 80% of its tanks were destroyed. By the end of the war, Israel had occupied the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza. Egypt suffered more than 30,000 casualties in total, around 11,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. This crushing defeat shattered the prestige of the army and deeply undermined Nasser's leadership. For the Arab front, the war ended in overwhelming humiliation and massive territorial loss. Nasser resigned in the aftermath of the defeat, only to retract his resignation the following day. Although he survived the war politically, his leadership position in the Arab world collapsed completely. The social impact of the war was equally severe. Socialist student unions dissolved at universities, and many young people joined the Muslim Brotherhood or nationalist groups. This was the country Sadat inherited from Nasser. He took over Egypt burdened by economic crisis and an ongoing conflict with Israel. His goal was not to achieve total victory, but to attain political objectives. Sadat's goals were clear. The loss of confidence created by the Arab defeat of 1967 had to be overcome. The myth of Israel's invincibility had to be shattered, and US Middle East policies had to be altered. To achieve these goals, Sadat cooperated with Syria. On the 23rd of April 1973, he reached an agreement with Hafez al-Assad on a joint operation. Until August 1973, Egypt secretly moved troops and equipment to the banks of the Suez Canal under the guise of annual military exercises. Because the operation was presented as an exercise, it did not attract Israel's attention or provoke a reaction. On the morning of the 6th of October 1973, the Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal as planned and attacked Sinai. Within hours, units that breached the defenses of Israel's Bar-Lev line landed on the Sinai shore. Egyptian soldiers raised the Egyptian flag in Sinai as a symbol of victory. This unexpected success produced a dramatic surge in morale within the army. A wave of enthusiasm swept through the public. A sense of unity emerged in a society that had begun to leave behind the shock of previous defeats. In the days that followed, the Egyptian army established pontoon bridges and seized additional positions. The operation to reclaim Sinai would reinforce the army's strength under Sadat's leadership. Sadat himself was proclaimed the hero of the crossing for shattering Israel's myth of invincibility during the canal crossing. However, this advance did not translate into long-term superiority. In the second week of the war, the Israeli army regrouped and launched a counteroffensive. Strengthened by American airlift support, Israeli forces began searching for weak points on the Egyptian front. A unit under the command of General Ariel Sharon crossed to the west bank of the Suez Canal and reached the rear lines of the Egyptian army. This maneuver altered the course of the war. At the same time, the Israeli Air Force carried out intensive strikes against Egypt's logistical lines. Even so, Egypt's and Sadat's plan to achieve a tableside victory through a limited war appeared to have caught the attention of the right actors. US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger came to Cairo and met with Sadat. Egypt now seemed to have risen to the status of a state conducting direct negotiations with the United States. The war halted on the 22nd of October as losses mounted on both sides. Egypt's principal gain, however, would come on the international stage. As the conflict deepened, both the United States and the Soviet Union became rapidly involved. Soviet leader Alexei Kosygin called Sadat on the 16th of October, urging him to halt the operation. OPEC also imposed an oil embargo, demanding Israel's withdrawal. These developments quickly forced the West toward peace negotiations. For Sadat, the priority was to convert military achievement into diplomatic gain and secure a lasting peace. He believed the path to fully reclaiming Sinai lay at the negotiating table. At a time when the United States sought to expand its role in the region, diplomatic traffic intensified along the Cairo-Washington axis. In Sadat's view, American involvement was also an important opportunity to strengthen Egypt's position within the international system and create conditions suitable for economic opening. He was unwilling to risk a new front, convinced that direct contact with Israel was necessary. Sadat became the first leader to openly advocate this position. With the ceasefire, direct negotiations between Egypt and Israel began. The Geneva Conference convened in December 1973 under US and Soviet auspices, marking the first multilateral peace initiative. Through Kissinger's intensive shuttle diplomacy, two separate Sinai agreements were signed in 1974 and 1975. These agreements ensured Israel's withdrawal from the banks of the Suez Canal and from certain positions in Sinai. Egypt, in turn, eased some economic and military measures against Israel. During this process, the US role as mediator grew stronger, and a new Washington-centered line began to emerge in Egyptian foreign policy. Sadat chose to exclude Soviet influence entirely and pursue a diplomatic solution solely through the United States. Sadat demonstrated a willingness to take risks to resolve the conflict. He believed progress was possible without being trapped by regional blockades. This belief led him to take an extraordinary step. His historic visit to Jerusalem in 1977 reverberated strongly both in Arab public opinion and in the Western world. President Sadat projected the image of a leader seeking peace. This move, however, provoked intense backlash within the Arab League. Despite this, he did not retreat. In contacts held under the mediation of US President Jimmy Carter prior to the Camp David talks, Sadat put forward Israel's withdrawal to the 1967 borders and the full return of Sinai to Egypt as fundamental conditions. He also insisted that the Palestinian issue be included on the agenda. Throughout the Camp David negotiations, he based his diplomatic approach on pragmatism rather than rigidity. Although differences with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin were clear, he demonstrated political resolve in pursuit of an agreement. The talks that began in September 1978 at the Camp David presidential retreat in Maryland, United States, lasted 13 days. They featured intense negotiations among Egyptian President Sadat, Israeli Prime Minister Begin, and US President Carter. Sadat faced two options. He could prioritize the Palestinian cause, preserve the Arab League, and overturn the negotiating table, or he could prioritize Egypt's interests, recognize Israel's existence, and recover Sinai. At Camp David, Sadat effectively declared, "Every sheep is responsible for its own leg." Two separate documents emerged from the negotiations. The first aimed to establish peace between Egypt and Israel. The second outlined a general framework for resolving the Palestinian issue. As a result of the talks, Israel agreed to withdraw from the occupied Sinai Peninsula. Egypt became the first Arab country to formally recognize Israel. With the signing of the agreement, Sadat opened the doors to a new era both domestically and internationally. Washington defines Sadat as one of its most important allies in the Middle East. The joint awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Begin and Sadat became one of the key symbols of this transformation. Yet these gains came at significant regional cost. Immediately after the agreement, Egypt was subjected to diplomatic isolation by the Arab League. The League's headquarters was moved from Cairo to Tunis. Countries such as Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Algeria accused the Sadat administration of betrayal. As pan-Arab solidarity fractured, Egypt would face years of isolation within the Arab world. Domestic reactions also followed swiftly. Leftist circles accused the agreement of paving the way for imperialism in the region. For Islamist groups, recognition of Israel constituted an unforgivable act of betrayal. Sadat's political course grew increasingly isolated. The diplomatic and economic gains brought by peace proved insufficient to suppress rising domestic opposition. While Camp David elevated Sadat's stature on the international stage, this image also laid the groundwork for a rupture that deepened political fault lines within the country. Left-leaning Nasserists and socialists criticized Sadat's development-oriented economic liberalization policies. They argued that the abandonment of statism had led to growing inequalities in income distribution. Rising allegations of corruption and favoritism also became central themes of the opposition's criticism. Islamist opponents, meanwhile, strongly condemned Sadat's steps towards secularization and normalization with Israel. Islamists believed that religious principles were not being fully applied in the governance of the country. Conservatives claimed that Sadat was increasingly drifting toward a westernized and secular orientation. When Sadat came to power, he released Muslim Brotherhood leaders who had been imprisoned. He believed they could serve as a counterbalance to Nasserist leftist groups. However, events did not unfold as Sadat had hoped. The Muslim Brotherhood expanded its support among dissatisfied segments of society. As religious sentiment spread within Egyptian society, new Salafi groups also emerged. Violence-prone cells broke away from the Muslim Brotherhood and formed the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group. Figures such as Muhammad Abdel Salam Faraj, a former Brotherhood member, aimed to overthrow the pro-Western regime and establish Islamic law. The Jihad group viewed Sadat's changing policies as a betrayal of Islam. It regarded the Camp David Accords as part of an interfaith alliance with Israel and accepted this move as legitimate justification for ending Sadat's rule. By the autumn of 1981, repression against the opposition had intensified dramatically. On the night of the 3rd of September 1981, Anwar Sadat ordered the arrest of approximately 1,600 people in a single sweep. Those detained included not only Muslim Brotherhood members and radical Islamist cells, but also leftist journalists, writers and trade union leaders. With this massive wave of arrests, the opposition was forced underground as experienced activists were removed from the scene. By the autumn of 1981, an atmosphere of unease had begun to spread across the country. The military was receiving assassination intelligence from various quarters. Yet, despite credible warnings, a general sense of complacency prevailed. Sadat did not avoid appearing among the public. For the 8th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, a large military parade was planned for the 6th of October 1981. This day was seen as an ideal opportunity to strengthen the bond between the people and the army. The celebrations began in the capital under tight security measures. Sadat arrived at the parade ground as usual in his ceremonial vehicle, wearing a uniform adorned with medals. He greeted the crowd and took his place at the reviewing stand. Seated beside him were the highest civilian and military officials of the state. The Egyptian Chief of Staff, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and representatives of several foreign delegations were all present in the same protocol area. While Air Force jets performed aerial displays, armored units were expected to pass on the ground. When it came time for a military convoy carrying special units conducting a training exercise, the atmosphere changed abruptly. A truck approaching the parade ground suddenly stopped in the middle of the procession. 4 uniformed men jumped out of the vehicle. They were armed with automatic weapons. One of them was Khalid al-Islambouli. Captain Islambouli, who leapt from the vehicle carrying a long-barreled rifle, and the other 3 attackers were officially assigned to the parade. No one fully grasped what was happening. Some thought it was part of the demonstration. But seconds later, the machine gun spoke. Islambouli and his team moved directly toward Anwar Sadat. One of the first grenades landed a few meters in front of the protocol row but failed to detonate. Automatic gunfire followed. Sadat tried to stand up, and his guards attempted to shield him, but it was already too late. He was hit repeatedly in the back, neck, and leg. When he collapsed, he was still alive but gravely wounded. Within seconds, the parade ground turned into chaos. Some members of the protocol crawled away from the platform. Egypt's commander-in-chief lay severely wounded. The vice president of Sudan was killed. The US ambassador was lightly wounded. Security forces captured Islambouli within minutes. One of the attackers was killed at the scene, and another was shot while attempting to flee. The parade ground was rapidly evacuated. Sadat was placed in an ambulance and taken to the Cairo military hospital. However, bullets had struck critical parts of his body, leaving the Egyptian leader in critical condition. He suffered massive internal bleeding. Doctors fought for nearly an hour to save his life. Despite all efforts, President Sadat died at around 2 p.m. Anwar Sadat had fallen victim to the divisions and wave of internal backlash that followed the Camp David process. Immediately after the assassination, thousands were detained. Islamist organizations, student groups, and radical cells were targeted. The presidency was temporarily transferred to Vice President Hosni Mubarak, who would be formally elected president by referendum a few days later. Sadat's funeral was held with a military ceremony on the 8th of October 1981. The event vividly reflected Egypt's shifting political orientation in recent years, while US President Ronald Reagan and many Western leaders attended the funeral. Not a single Arab head of state was present. The organization behind the attack was identified as the Islamic Jihad Organization. The cell led by Khalid al-Islambouli cited the failure to annul the Camp David Accords and to declare Islamic law as the justification for the assassination. Islambouli was executed shortly afterward. In the years that followed, however, he became a symbolic figure for radical Islamist movements across the Middle East. The relative peace policy that Anwar Sadat sought to advance through Camp David had produced a fracture this deep at home. Sadat was the first Arab leader to attempt to resolve the Israel question, still one of the region's greatest uncertainties, by taking significant risks and pursuing a different path. Yet this initiative ended with him becoming the target of an armed movement that emerged from within his own society.